You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature webcast and podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And as the war in Ukraine continues to escalate, today's conversation will focus on a question that's at the heart of the conflict. Will Russia use its nuclear or chemical arsenal against Ukraine? What would prompt the nation to take such a drastic measure? And if these weapons are used, what would happen next, both in Ukraine and beyond? Joining me today is Dr. Lori Esposito Murray. Lori is the president of the Committee for Economic Development, which is the public policy center of the Conference Board. Lori, welcome to the program.
Steve, thank you. It's a privilege to be here today with you and to be part of TCB's efforts and your efforts to help inform our membership across the TCB international community on these very important issues at this critical time in our history.
Yeah, and Lori, you hate it when I do this, but I want to share some of your past experiences because we're going to be commenting on some very serious issues that are going on, and I can't think of a better expert in the world, and you happen to be part of our group, to do this. Lori, you most recently served as Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. You were a Distinguished National Security Chair teaching nuclear warfare at the U.S. Naval Academy. You're the President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council. You were a special advisor to President Clinton on the Chemical Weapons Convention. You were an Assistant Director for Multilateral Affairs at the State Department regarding U.S. arms control and disarmament, an Executive Director of the Department of Defense's Federal Advisory Committee on Gender Integrated Training in the Military. You headed congressionally mandated U.S.-China Security and Economic Review Commission. You were a consultant in the Bush administration on weapons of mass destruction. You spent a decade as National Security Advisor to Senator Nancy Kassebaum, you were a professional associate to the National Academy of Sciences regarding international security and arms control, and you have a PhD from Johns Hopkins in international studies. So, Laura, I just can't think of a better, I know you get embarrassed when I review that, but I think it's very important for our listeners to know your expertise in this area. So let's talk about the nuclear capability first. What nations have nuclear capability? And when we say that, what do we really mean by that? What kind of capability do these nations have?
So, Steve, starting with that very important overview, right now there are about 13,000 nuclear weapons held by 9 countries. But what's really significant about that is, first of all, we have come down from a peak. So we're at 13,000. We've come down from a peak of 70,000 nuclear weapons in 1986. Significant 85% reductions since 1986. So 13,000 nuclear weapons, 85% reductions in US and Russian weapons. And I will say of that 13,000, as has been consistent throughout our nuclear history, the US and Russia hold about 90% of those. We've actually held more, but that gets to your question of who else has nuclear weapons. We've actually had a higher percentage, but over the years, since the US tested its first nuclear weapon in 1945 and the Soviets in 1949, we've had 9 countries, China, North Korea, France, India, Israel, Pakistan, United Kingdom, joining the US and Russia in terms of being nuclear capable states. But I do want to underscore the point that those other countries have much fewer nuclear weapons. The US and Russia have about 4,000 each. It's a little bit higher than that, but those are ready to be dismantled. But in terms of nuclear weapons that are actually in the stockpile, it's about 4,000 each. China has about 350 nuclear weapons, and we're expecting them to, the anticipation is that will double that in the next 10 years. France has about 290, United Kingdom 225, India, Pakistan about 150 each, Israel about 90, and North Korea is estimated, and this is by looking at their fissile material, estimated to have the capacity for about 40 to 50 nuclear weapons right now. And these are all, I should underscore, these are all public figures that I'm using.
Yeah. So 9 nations, but 90% in the US and the Russia. And in the latter part of the 20th century, the whole mantra was MAD, mutually assured destruction, meaning that, with these weapons pointed at each other, if one launched, the other would automatically launch, thereby assuring mutual destruction, thereby assuring nobody would use these things. Okay, so now here we are in 2022, and Russia is threatening to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Why is Russia threatening this? What happened to MAD, and where are we on this?
Well, this has been an evolution. Even under mutual assured destruction, it looks at escalation and if you use a nuclear weapon, how quickly it would escalate to all-out nuclear war. But getting to what is happening now, and it really is an extremely dangerous time in terms of security, our security, Europe's security, and global security in terms of what Russia is threatening as far as use of nuclear weapons. What is happening is that after we did the very severe sanctions, Putin's response both to the sanctions themselves, and this is how he put it in his public address, as well as to what he called the aggressive language of NATO leaders. He said that he was actually raising the level of his combat readiness of his nuclear weapons. We've actually have seen no, according to our defense officials, again, publicly saying that they've seen no actual implementation of that in terms of anything changing as far as their nuclear capabilities being rearranged. But he announced that, and he announced it not just against Ukraine, it was actually a threat against NATO leaders for their aggressive statements. And that's really significant because their strategic policy is basically, as it has been colloquially defined, as escalate to de-escalate. So it's the use of a tactical nuclear weapon or smaller nuclear weapon or a demonstration nuclear weapon to actually intimidate the opponents, their adversaries, to negotiate. But what Putin actually said publicly was a much broader and more severe threat by actually threatening US and NATO leaders, meaning that he was actually indicating a beyond just a simple use of a tactical nuclear weapon to intimidate people to actually win a conflict at the negotiating table.
So escalate to de-escalate, meaning they would potentially use something like this in order to force capitulation and therefore, end the conflict. So you mentioned tactical nuclear weapons. I think nuclear weapons are generally structured or separated into these two broad classifications, strategic and tactical. Can you kind of help us understand the difference between the two? And by threatening the use of tactical, how should we interpret that as different from strategic?
Yeah, and I do want to underscore what I just was trying to point out is that Putin didn't make that distinction in his threat.
He did not.
He did not. By threatening NATO leaders, he did not make that distinction that this would just be a use of a tactical weapon as a escalate to de-escalate strategy, which we have determined is really part of their strategic approach to nuclear weapons, their strategy as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. So what's interesting about your question about the difference between tactical and strategic, I do want to start with the quote from General Mattis in his hearings to become Secretary of Defense, where he said that there is no such thing as a tactical nuclear capability when he was asked about this, because any use of a nuclear weapon would be a strategic game changer. And that gets you to the serious and dangerous and destabilizing part of this, that any use of a nuclear weapon, no matter what size the warhead or its capability, would actually put you up this escalation ladder very quickly. But to answer your question directly about the differentiation, Russia, we assess, have about 2,000 non-strategic weapons. And the US has about 230. And that sounds like a real disparity, but in fact, the way you define them is, where they fit in terms of your use and range. When we have the strategic arms control talks, we have a range for strategic nuclear weapons, for intermediate nuclear weapons, and everything below that, about 500 kilometers and below that, are considered non-strategic. And now with the collapse of the intermediate nuclear weapons agreement, the INF treaty, you could capture those larger ranges in there too and stop at strategic. But without getting into too much detail, I was going to say that what the US decision was actually won over a number of years. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we actually started getting rid of our tactical nuclear weapons. That was a very deliberate decision on the part of Secretary McNamara, because he saw them as really dangerous and destabilizing, because they were in the field, they were under a commander in the field could make a decision to use them, and all of a sudden we were up a nuclear escalation ladder. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev actually had an informal arrangement where the US pulled back most of its non-strategic systems, precisely because they were destabilizing. They could be stolen, by terrorists, and you didn't want these scattered all over the world. Made a very serious decision, and also you didn't want them in the hands of, again, this command and control problem. That the more you have command and control at a lower level, you're actually putting yourself on an escalation ladder if a decision is made either because of a miscalculation. So we pulled ours back. We have about 100 what we call the gravity bombs that are deployed in Europe in 5 countries, and then we have about the remainder here in the US. And for Russia, this was a very important part. They pulled back these tactical nuclear weapons from the former Soviet Union, as well as from Eastern European countries, pulled them back behind the Russian border. And the Russian border became much smaller in terms of Europe, pulled them back, and also removed strategic nuclear weapons from Belarus and Ukraine. But they became a very important part of their post-Cold War strategy because, in fact, the situation flipped from the Cold War, where we relied more on nuclear weapons during the Cold War because the Soviets had a larger military force. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, it actually flipped, where NATO and the US had a larger conventional force, and Russia began to rely more on nuclear weapons in terms of their deterrence strategy and their ability to counter US and NATO forces.
So Lori, strategic nuclear weapons are thought, generally to be those that you attach to a missile and send, at some distance, whereas tactical are battlefield use. But regardless of, as you said, regardless of how you classify them, you are using nuclear weapons with radiation and poisoning, and this stuff doesn't clear up, with the next breeze. It lasts hundreds of years, and you essentially destroy the ability to use this geography. So when they are threatening to use these weapons, are they threatening to use these weapons in Ukraine, or are they threatening to use these weapons and send ballistic missiles to NATO countries?
So, as I mentioned, Putin's threat was broader. Putin's threat was a much broader threat. But in terms of planning for how to deal with the actual war in Ukraine, you have to take into account, our military planners are political leaders, and this is what's happening in Europe right now. You have to take into account that it could be either or, and that a tactical nuclear weapon could be used, just one, could be used as either a demonstration weapon where they do something over in the Arctic, where they explode a nuclear weapon just to show that they're about to use it, or they actually use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. There's a significant point here that is also a significant development that is also signaling to the West, and part of this threat, signaling to NATO, the US, and Ukraine, was that on February 27th, Belarus, which had actually given up its nuclear weapons, as Ukraine did as well after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and return those warheads back to Russia. Belarus had a referendum on February 27th, and the referendum in the on their new constitution included that it was no longer going to consider itself a non-nuclear status nation, and that it now retains the right to actually be or host Russian nuclear weapons. That was a pretty significant signal to Ukraine and to US and NATO in terms of intimidation, as well as you have to take it into account in terms of attention that they would actually hold.
Yeah, and you have to pay attention to Belarus, since they now have announced that they're going to send soldiers in also to join Russian soldiers in the invasion of Ukraine. So the other thing that you touched on, but just to make clear, the U.S. and Russia were parties to post-Soviet Union breakup to clearing the weapons from Ukraine. And talk about the security. Talk about the agreement that that we had with Ukraine when they moved the nuclear weapons out, because there were some promises there that that were pretty significant.
Right, and this was an agreement among the U.S., UK, Britain, and Russia. And there were a couple of thousand strategic nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which when it was part of the Soviet Union. And the decision was to remove those nuclear weapons, send the warheads back to be dismantled, and that Ukraine got promises that its sovereignty would be protected. And we're hearing this now, which actually, I think undermines the ability that could be a off-ramp, at least for Ukraine, because they were given these promises by Russia, the U.S., and the UK that if they help to dismantle these systems and allow the warheads to be moved back and to Russia, that they would their sovereignty would be protected and respected. And the Russian invasion in Crimea in 2014, actually, just tore that agreement up from the early 1990s. And to hear now that part of an off-ramp may be that Ukraine declares its neutrality, doesn't maintain a defensive, a military, but gets security guarantees. I'm sure that is like nails on a chalkboard for the Ukrainians, because they've been there before in terms of the security guarantees.
We've talked about the Russian nuclear capability and why they may decide to use such weapons. Next, we'll consider the likelihood that Russia will also deploy chemical weapons and potentially biological weapons as potential scenarios. We'll take a short break. Be right back with my conversation with Dr. Lori Esposito Murray.
As war rages in Ukraine, the Conference Board is closely monitoring the situation and producing timely and relevant content on a daily basis that will help the business community navigate this global geopolitical unrest. What will the impact be on oil prices, food prices, our supply chain, and what about cybersecurity? How will this conflict impact the way your organization does business around the world, and how will you communicate this crisis to customers and employees? We're gathering the very latest content on our website. Just head to conference-board.org and find trusted insights to help you and your team lead with confidence.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined by Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, the president of the Committee for Economic Development, which is the public policy center of the Conference Board. Lori, what happens in the domino game if Russia does use nuclear weapons? Does it end there? Is it just, as you said, a demonstration where they fire one off just to say that they're serious and force capitulation? Or does it escalate from there?
So I think the best way to answer that question, Steve, is because it's hard to know what would happen. And, for the understanding of everyone, listening to this, just how the United States, and I'm sure the same thing is happening in Russia, is that we run the whole point of the National Security Council on any issue, but particularly during crisis, is to actually organize the leadership of the government on the national security side to present options and and run scenarios for the president in terms of what may happen and present options for how the U.S. can respond. And what you saw in the what was actually a story in the New York Times this morning about this Tiger team, that is really a very standard operational practice for the National Security Council. But what's different now is that for the first time in many years, we are actually considering the use, we were actually having to deal with the probability of the use of nuclear weapons. And so the best example I could give you, because war games are actually run in the nonprofit world, and RAND and other groups are constantly running war games for officials and former officials to participate in. Princeton has a war game, a simulation that was devised by its experts. And it has Moscow firing a nuclear warning shot, and NATO responds with a small strike. And the war that follows has more than 90 million casualties, and that happens in the first few hours. And so the escalation of a warning shot by Moscow in a conflict actually escalates within a few hours in this Princeton war game, and results in 90 million casualties.
Doesn't sound like a game, does it? They should call it something else besides war games. But I think what you're talking about is a very serious escalation. In other words, if they fire a warning shot, and if there is a subsequent warning shot fired back, the simulations end up with 90 million casualties.
Yes, and what I also want to emphasize, what is really interesting, observing how the administration is responding to these threats. And I should also point out that Putin has been saber rattling, since he came into power, in 1999, 2000. The nuclear piece of this, because Russia was so weak militarily after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And remember, they lost about 40% of their population in terms of the republics. And they also lost their allies in Eastern Europe. So the nuclear piece of this became a very important part of their ability to present a deterrent to the world, that they were still a militarily capable country. So that's why nuclear weapons became so important. But Putin has been saber rattling. He also threatened the use of nuclear weapons when he invaded Crimea as well. So, but the intensity of this and the seriousness of what's happening in Ukraine, and the fact that now you're seeing a counteroffensive by the part of the Ukrainians, the very terrible performance of the Russian military in Ukraine, the loss of 5 or 6 generals. It's a really serious and dangerous situation. But I was going to say, in terms of how the U.S. is responding, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were several mistakes that were made. We raised our military level in terms of nuclear response, our combat readiness. We raised that level during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was also a nuclear weapons test that was not supposed to happen, that happened just because it was not deliberately canceled. So there were situations that happened that could have escalated the crisis, could have been read wrong in terms of signaling on the part of the Soviet Union at the time. And I will say that the US government right now is being very careful. They did not respond by raising their combat readiness level in terms of nuclear weapons when Putin made his statement. We did not respond that way. And I think the overriding sense is really to try and make sure, and you hear this in everything the president is saying about he does not want this to become World War III. We are not committing US troops, that the US and NATO are being very careful in how they are responding and what signals they are sending back to Russia and to the world, in terms of not looking like we are provoking that type of reaction.
What about chemical and biological weapons? Russia's always also has threatened the use, and the US administration came out yesterday and warned that this was a possibility, that Russia could use chemical weapons in Ukraine. What kind of weapons are these, and would they really consider using them?
So part of the reason why you're hearing more about chemical weapons than biological weapons, in my view, is that I actually think the probability of use is higher with chemical weapons than it is with biological weapons. But biological weapons, you really run the risk of it affecting your own troops, harder to contain. And also, I would just make the point that in terms of conducting a war during a pandemic, in fact, Russia is only making sure that this pandemic is even more of a problem for Europe with the massive refugee influx into Europe and the fact that even within Ukraine itself, it's very hard to be taking care of containing the COVID under wartime situations. But so biological weapons are a little bit more difficult in terms of, actually having, I think, utility. So you're hearing more emphasis about chemical weapons. And there were three types of chemical weapons, just very quickly. Choking agents, that's chlorine, which you saw a lot of that used in Syria. Blister agents, which is mustard, that's poison ivy on steroids. And the more advanced lethal nerve agents. And that's where you hear sarin or VX. And of course, you have the Russian development of Novichok as well, which is considered 10 times as lethal as VX. So those are the weapons. What is really concerning is that whether Putin is deciding to use nuclear weapons or not, he is laying the groundwork for the use of nuclear weapons. And you look back at Syria and what happened in Syria, you see the same groundwork being laid in terms of disinformation. He's talking about Ukraine and the US having biological and chemical weapon capabilities, a lot of disinformation as if they are being provoked, as if they are protecting themselves from this threat. The US has called out the intelligence on this, as we have throughout this entire conflict as it was building, and trying to make it clear that this is disinformation, but it is laying the groundwork for the use of chemical weapons. And the other piece that's really concerning is that, and you look at Syria, or if you look at Saddam Hussein's use of chemical weapons against his own population, the Kurds, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, is that the military situation is very similar. You have frustration in terms of trying to control and actually overtake major cities. And I said it's the frustration, the fact that Russia is performing so poorly, and the fact that you're trying to control and overtake an urban population in an urban city center, very similar to how these weapons were used in Syria, is why there is such concern that these weapons may be used in Ukraine.
But Lori, Russia has one of the largest standing armies in the world, nearly 1 million members. They're thought to be, or they were thought to be, extremely advanced in their training and their capabilities. They've now brought on conscripts. They're using mercenaries from Chechnya and Syria. So if all of this is true, why on earth would they threaten the use of nuclear and chemical weapons rather than using conventional forces?
So going back to the larger perspective, the Russians see themselves at a disadvantage in terms of size of military. That's what flipped after compared to NATO and the US. So in Europe, that's what flipped in terms of how their doctrine had changed in terms of the use, the need for these weapons and the use. But I should say, in terms of chemical weapons, the Russians, as of just a few years ago, have announced that under the Chemical Weapons Convention, that they have actually destroyed their entire chemical weapons stockpile. They made a declaration as to what that was, and that they actually have destroyed those weapons. And but at the same time, we've watched Russia support, along with China, and protect Syria in the United Nations in terms of any retaliation in terms of sanctions or isolation diplomatically, always voting against UN resolutions and protecting Syria from international condemnation for its use of chemical weapons. That combined with the fact that they've actually used chemical weapons against individuals, and this is the case on foreign territory in a NATO country. They actually went after a double agent and his daughter, the Skripal case, as we all know, and used Novichok, a very advanced agent. And that was messaging to the world that they could care less about international rules-based order. Arms control agreements and the Chemical Weapons Convention was a really significant one. And also the fact that they couldn't care less that they were doing it in a NATO country, and they used Novichok, and which ended up affecting more than just the double agent and his daughter that they were going after. And they also used it against their political opposition in Moscow as well, or in Russia as well.
So final question here. How does this end, Lori? Does this just saber rattle, and there's a solution that is negotiated, or is it just preordained that this is going to escalate to de-escalate?
Well, what's really critical is there are several reasons why in Russian doctrine, why they would use nuclear weapons. And one is if there's a launch of a ballistic missile. Two is if the adversary uses it first. Three is if their actual capability to use nuclear weapons through a conventional attack is, if they have to absorb that attack, they would use nuclear weapons. But four is the most important. And this is what you heard Peskov, the Russian spokesperson, say these words just 2 days ago. Which is existential. If it's an existential threat to Russia, they will use, that they reserve the right to use nuclear weapons. What's really concerning about that is existential threat to Russia. And what's really concerning about that is it is an existential threat to Putin. And that Putin really does, and it's not an existential threat to Russia, but it's an existential threat to Putin, if that's how Putin then interprets, the use of nuclear weapons. So how does this end? You could have, we'll continue. I mean, there are several options. It's really hard to play out. And, that's why I think very cool heads in terms of US and NATO to really think this through and not to just be reacting in the moment. And I think we're doing that really well and maintaining unity. But, you could obviously end the conflict through negotiations. It could just be stalemate is not really the right word, because stalemate means, you're really meaning that no one is actually getting the advantage, but many civilians will be getting killed. The use of conventional forces, as they did in Grozny, for example, where they didn't escalate to chemical or nuclear weapons, becomes a long-standing war of attrition, and we continue sanctions, and it really just goes on, which a number of analysts are really beginning to believe that that's where this may be heading. You could have regime change, which I think is also not likely given the history of our sanctions in terms of trying to promote regime change. We may have had behavior change on certain issues, but in terms of regime change, you look at Syria, you look at Venezuela, Iran, you just go down the list of countries where we've had very serious sanctions, and we haven't seen regime change. So, I think Putin has a strong enough lockhold on right now, at least in Russia. And then it obviously escalation, and and that could be escalation in terms of cyber, chemical, nuclear, attack on nuclear reactors, and that's what we have to be prepared to first try and deter. And second, that's why these very important meetings are happening in Europe right now in terms of how to respond to that and prepare for that. And I think what you're going to see come out as part of this, these meetings in Europe, is actually helping the Ukrainian forces receive the type of material that allows them to fight in those environments. And I would just caution that fighting in an environment with chemical weapons, and this all suits Putin's purposes, you have to wear a lot of equipment. And so it actually affects your movement and mobility. And so that serves Putin's purposes, even if he doesn't use these weapons. It also serves his purposes to have refugees racing out of Ukraine because of fear of the use of these weapons. And just as you saw in Syria, there is a strategic purpose to that. One, you remove the opposition, possible opposition within the country, but two, even more importantly, the refugee influx into Europe, as we saw with Syria. Half of Syria was either displaced or refugees. Of 22 million people, you had about 11 million displaced or refugees. 6 of those were actually, million of those were actually refugees. You're seeing the same thing happening in Ukraine. This really disrupts the country's economies and their governments, and causes, could possibly cause unrest within those countries as the economic crunch happens, as you're trying to absorb refugees. So that in and of itself is destabilizing and has a strategic purpose to threaten these weapons as well. And, so just by escalating in terms of threats, as well as the possible having to prepare for an escalation on cyber, nuclear, chemical, or unconventional weapons, is really a serious effort to respond to, try to prevent and prepare for.
All very sobering. Lori, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Steve. Again, it's a privilege to have the opportunity to work with you and be part of our larger efforts at the conference board in helping our members, the business community, understand these issues and their role in it.
Yes, it's very important. And thanks to all of you for listening to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in economics, public policy, ESG, human capital, and geopolitics. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues. Everybody should be listening to these insights. They're very important. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, your source of trusted insights for what's ahead. For the latest insights to help guide your business through this time of geopolitical unrest, we have daily and relevant updates on our website at conference-board.org.